Okay, so we're actually on Nun Beis Amud Aleph at the very bottom. The last word on the line, Meisvei, is where we stop. But before we launch into the Meisvei, let's just back up a little bit and just do a quick review of what got us here, so we'll understand what the Meisvei is. The Meisvei is going to ask a kasha. So the Gemara immediately preceding went back and we discussed what happens when again, we're talking about coins that erode, and we have to keep in mind what their value is for purposes of being able to be used in the marketplace. So we shouldn't be over or no. So the Gemara says that when the seller, which is the main coin, this is the dollar, we say the seller is the main coin, when it erodes, then it can't erode more than a half and still be valid. So again, you have a seller as the top of the line, 2 shekalim make a seller, and 2 dinarim make a shekel. So if it erodes up to the point where it's halfway, so it's still valid, or slightly more than halfway, still valid as a shekel, then the main concern is that someone will still think it's a seller, because when you look at it, you can see it eroded, but you don't necessarily think it's eroded to the point where it is less than a shekel. So that becomes very subjective when someone looks at the coin and says, okay, so this coin, it doesn't look too bad. So people can still use it at its best value, which is a seller. So the Gemara tells us that, basically, if it erodes more than halfway, so the Gemara said previously, then you can't really use it as a seller. So in order not to confuse, you should take it out of circulation and use it as a weight. So if it's used as a weight, it's not in circulation and people don't confuse it. But then the Gemara asks, but how much can it really erode and you can still use it, that you're allowed to use it? So the Gemara says that for a seller, it's 2 dinarim. 2 dinarim is a shekel. So, and then the Gemara says, if it's less than that, then you have to destroy it so as not to have people confuse it. Then we had a machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Ami. What was the machlokes? Rav Huna said that, of course, if it's less than 2 dinarim, you have to cut it up, because then people will confuse it. But he said, but here, listen, he says, Yasser al Kain, but even if it's more than 2 dinarim, you have to also destroy it or cut it up. Yokich means to cut up. Why do you have to cut it up? Because because even if it's a little bit more, then people will confuse it with a shekel, with a seller, and it really should only be a shekel. In other words, if you have a coin that erodes up to or just about halfway, then according to Rav Huna, you shouldn't be using that coin as a seller. It's already lost half its value, and you certainly are over oino. So oino is one issue, but even using it, he's saying you shouldn't use it. So according to Rav Huna, if it has a little bit of erosion, a small amount, let's just say up to a quarter of it, okay, fine, people will still use it as a seller. But if it gets down to the shekel category, it's dangerously close, then he's saying it doesn't matter if it's a little bit more than a shekel or a little bit less than a shekel. If it's a little bit more than a shekel, people will think it's a seller. And if it's less than a shekel, and it should only be used as a dinner, people will think it is a shekel. So according to Rav Huna, he's machmir, and he says both ways you have to be extremely cautious. Take it out of circulation if it's eroded up to that sort of 50% mark, 51, 49. Rav Ami says no. Rav Ami says if it's less, okay, I agree with you. But yes, okay. But if it's more than a shekel, if it's more than, meaning, let's say it eroded 47%, so it's a 53%. According to him, it's okay. Why is it okay? Because he says you can use it. In other words, you can use it if someone later comes to Taina and says, I want my money back. You have to always be open to giving him his money back. But maybe people aren't makbid, and they see something that, okay, it's eroded from a seller, but it's still to be considered a valid coin, then so basically he's Mako, and he says you can use that coin even as a seller because it hasn't eroded to that 50% mark. So that's the machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Ami, and this is where our Gemara now is going to pick up and trying to show, do we hold like Rav Huna or do we hold like Rav Ami? But basically the machlokes is when you get close to that 50% mark, where is the concern? According to Rav Ami, the concern is only on the downside, not from shekel to selah. And according to Rav Huna, the concern is both ways. A little bit more, you shouldn't be using it as a selah, and you might, and a little bit less, you shouldn't be using it as a shekel because it's already less than a shekel, but you also might. So he says both ways cancel it out and take it out of circulation. All right, so that's the machlokes that we left with last week. Now the Gemara says at the very bottom, Meisvei. All right, so now we're going to ask a kasha.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, Rabbi, where are we holding?
Nun Beis Amen Aleph, the very bottom, Meisvei.
Yeah, thank you.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
So based on that machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Ami, says the Gemara Meisvei. All right, so now we have a kasha. What's the kasha?
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah, Jay.
When you're discussing if it goes all the way down and weight, just above half, then it's still considered the larger coin. Why did they let it go down so far? They should have let it stay to a quarter or a third, but to take it down to a half, you've really lost a lot of value.
Right. So the thinking behind it is that, you monitor these coins. Again, it's not like today where we have such oversight and we can, pull coins out of circulation or whatever. You have to understand this. So at the time, a coin that was in circulation probably was in circulation almost loyal void. It kept, now over the course, I don't know how quickly, how many years, what it takes to erode a coin. Remember, they were purer coins. So
well, actually, let me speak to that.
Right,
actually, I looked it up a little bit after the last time, and what I found was that actually most of our coins today are not that much harder than the coins were thousands of years ago. They were using apparently alloys then as well, and they were nearly as hard as what we have today. So they didn't have some of the features. They weren't as neatly, cleanly made with the ridged edges on the quarter like we have in saw, which makes a clear indication of erosion. But apparently they were relatively durable compared to today. So my guess, like you said, it wasn't so easy to exchange coins. And I'm guessing, but this is just a guess, is that the coins were given more leniency into how much they could erode before you would have to say that, oh, this is too much compared to regular merchandise of, is a bushel really a full bushel kind of a thing where we're talking about a sixth before.
Yeah.
And my guess is that coins then as now had some significance by virtue of, okay, a shekel is a shekel, even if it's not perfect.
Can't you also assume that there was an exchange method? Somebody has a coin, he just receives it in the store, and he says, this thing is worn down. I'm going to go to the bank or whatever and say, I want a new one. And they should be able to get a new one if they held that it had the value, even though it was worn down. So people would go back and exchange it. But why let it go? Why let the system go all the way down to a half almost, or above a half?
Yeah,
when you could have taken it out of circulation at 20%. A warrant, why did it have to go that far down?
No, you're right. But the only thing you can say is it was probably not as regulated as maybe it should have been, so that coins were in circulation longer than they should have been. You're right. Maybe there should have been an oversight, or every time someone could, banks. Were there really banks? It was money changers. Money changers were really, we quote the banks at the time.
Chachamim were in charge of this whole operation. They could have specified 20% and turn it in for a new one. Why would they let it go down that far, which becomes a big issue of how close is it? How, it created a whole new world of uncertainty when it was preventable by the Chachamim who regulated this.
Right. Yeah. No, that's the point. That's a good point. But So maybe they should have, or maybe they had their own standard and said, no, it's got to be really, really bad before we take it out. But you see from the last couple of weeks in our discussion in the Gemara that these coins were around a long time. And clearly the Gemara talks about when they eroded to such a substantial point that they couldn't even be considered a dinar, which is a quarter of a selah. So your question, why did they throw it out of circulation when it got halfway bad or something else? Clearly, in the times of the Gemara, that wasn't either a priority or that wasn't how they operated. They operated with, okay, it erodes, let's just treat it as a lesser coin. In other words, it was easier to say, oh, this coin is eroded, let's treat it as a lesser coin than taking it out of circulation and saying, okay, we're going to review it and start with a bigger coin. That clearly seems to be the pattern, is that they let it get down, I won't say to almost nothing, but and I don't know how long it takes. How long does it take? How many years does it take for a coin with the width, the circumference and the thickness of a selah to really start eroding and eroding? It could take many, many years. And so in other words, people sort of, oh, that looks like a selah. Yeah, it's a selah. Okay, fine. I'll accept it as a selah. It's the money changers, and we're going to see that in the Gemara. It's the money changers who were the real experts. And at times, as the Gemara, we may or may not get to it today, but there's an interesting discussion about the money changers saying, okay, this selah is now worth, let's say, 30% of what it should be, but I'm only going to give you 29% because I, the money changer, want to make absolutely certain that I'm on firm ground. So I'm going to give you less than even what l'chaira it should be based on the market. So you see that these money changers, I mean, they kind of had a lot of influence and deciding when coins started getting really bad, and maybe that's how they made their money on little fractions of of a percentage, but obviously in volume that adds up. But and that's why the Gemara said to us, even in the last couple of weeks, what's the nafka between coins and talis, meaning a garment? They are two separate lines of thinking. What you think about when you have oinoah by a garment is not what you think about by coin. The Gemara made that point already. So we see that now that we're into this whole discussion of coins, the coins had a whole different perspective, because that was that's how commerce was perceived, was with coins. Even though you can exchange garments, you can barter and exchange garments, and which of course was very prevalent, but still coins have a different cheshbon. And your question is well put. Why not take it out of circulation? Obviously, that wasn't so easy.
I just looked up, and apparently they've measured, because they found different both ancient coins as well as weights that were used to clearly measure coins and so on. And so the Beis Hamikdash era shekel was about 11.5 grams, and that is actually just about the same as a current U.S. half dollar, which is basically twice a current U.S. quarter. So it give you an idea. About twice the weight of a quarter was a shekel.
So your shekel was a half a dollar.
Was equivalent in weight to a modern U.S. half dollar.
Okay, so then the selah would be a dollar. We've been talking about a selah as a dollar, just
so double that.
But in fact, the selah could really be the dollar, because two shekalim make a selah.
Yeah, but that gives it an idea. These were not teeny tiny little coins.
Right. So again, it's a fascinating view to understand how the system worked. But so now the Gemara. So we have this machlokes between Rav Huna, who was more conservative. He was really concerned about just not trickery, but in coinage, how people would perceive it. So he said, to be on the safe side, we're going to go both ways. If it's a little bit more than a shekel, I'm worried that people will use it as a selah, and if it's a little bit less than a shekel, then it should be a dinner, and people will use it as a shekel. So he said both ways I'm canceling out. And Ramami didn't have that same concern. Now the Gemara wants to understand, so whose view do we really follow? In other words, is Rav Huna right that we have to be more conservative in the way we approach this or not? So if it says the Gemara Mesave, I'll ask you a kasha. Yosa Alkain Mokra Bishavia. So the Brisa there said that if it was eroded more than, let's say, 50%, then the Brisa says you don't throw it out. It says instead of using it for its face value, which would be, let's say, a selah, you use it bishavia for its worth. Obviously, its worth is half that, or certainly not anything near a selah. So that's what the Brisa said. So we're saying the my love shepochsa yosem b'chdei einasa. So when the Brisa says that, so does that not mean? In other words, we're trying to interpret. Okay, that if it eroded to a point where it's einah, then you have to use it for what it's worth, not for its face value, right? But no matter how you look at it, you can hold on to it. You don't have to dispose of it. Rav Huna is the one who said that if it reaches the limit of einah, in other words, if it's way down there, then what? You should take it out of circulation, even more, a little bit more, a little bit less. But according to this Brisa, they're not talking about taking it out of circulation. The whole discussion is, do we treat it as a coin that still has its face value, or do we treat it as a coin that you can only use the actual value? Actual value means that if it ground down to a shekel from a selah, use it as a shekel, or even as a dinar. But you can use it. That's a raya against Rav Huna, because Rav Huna is the one who said you shouldn't even keep it in circulation. And this Bryce is telling us, no, you can keep it in circulation. The only question is, do you use it as its original value, which is what's called Sela Yofeh? In other words, a beautiful or pristine Sela, which is full value, or do you use it as Bishavya? And Bishavya means actual value. So that was the whole discussion, but not whether you throw it out or not. So that's really asked, I'll bring you a raya to Rav Huna, because the Brisa there doesn't even discuss taking it out of circulation. It just has a discussion of whether it is face or actual.
But
so that's the Gemara's
almost half the value is gone.
Right, and therefore the question is, okay, so you can't use it as a seller, but use it as a shekel. In other words, the Brisa inherently wasn't worried about Rav Huna's position. What Rav Huna's theory was that people would be taken advantage of. So therefore, whether it's a little bit more or a little bit less, just take it away so that people shouldn't be taken advantage of. The Brisa wasn't concerned with that. The Brisa, in other words, we're giving people more credit, like Rav Ami did, that if they see a coin that is, pretty worn down, then they're gonna, and let's say they deal with the storekeeper or someone else, then or the storekeeper may tell them, I can't accept it. You want to buy fruit or whatever, vegetables, you want to give me a selah. This isn't a selah. I can't accept it as a selah. I can only accept it as a shekel or whatever the denomination is. But yet they're not going to throw it out because of it. They'll still use it. So that's a raya to Rav Ami that we're not so makbid. We're makbid if a selah wears down to where it's almost a dinner, then okay, fine. Now we're really in trouble. So we'll take that selah out of circulation. But if a selah is just a little bit less than a shekel, which means that l'chayra you shouldn't even use it as a selah. So the Brisa says, fine, then use it for its actual value and not for its face value. Because even when a selah erodes, you can still see it was a selah. So that if you can see it's a selah, then you can say, oh, I can see it's a selah, let me use it as a selah. That's called yofeh. That's called meaning that it's in its original condition. But if you can see that it's already worn down to where it really looks pretty bad, then certainly a money changer wouldn't accept it. But people will say, okay, fine, I can't use this as a selah. I'll round it down to a shekel, but I'll use it. And according to Rav Huna, you shouldn't even use it. So that's the Gemara's kasha. L'chayra, this Brisa is a raya not like Rav Huna. So the Gemara says no. And here we're going to understand, we see this so many times that again, I'm going to point it out. You're going to see how the Gemara, when it's pinned, when it's backed up against the wall, and it seems like, okay, you've got me. It clearly seems to be that there's no way to wiggle out. the Gemara reinterprets the words to make it come out. And this is consistently in the Gemara, we see this, is that, and you're going to see what we mean here in a minute, that sometimes what you think the word means, it doesn't mean. And that's the way the Gemara is able to sort of justify how to explain. So what's the answer? Says the Gemara, no, it's not a kasha on Rav Huna. Why? Because when it says Yoser al Kain, more than that. So what do we think more than that is? If it erodes more than the amount, let's say, of a shekel, you can't use it as a seller. That's Pashup Pshat, and that's the way we've been interpreting it. Says the Gemara lo, no kasha on Rav Huna. Why? Yesera, when it says the word Yoser or Yesera, the akati lo pachsa b'chdei oinosa. In other words, it hasn't eroded halfway. There's two ways of looking at a coin. One is its physical appearance, okay, and more than not, when it's in circulation, most people will look at the physical appearance. Oh, this is a sella. It looks as a sella. I know a sella has what a diameter of what 3, let's say, inches, whatever it has, 2 inches, whatever it is, and this looks pretty close to that. So people will use an eye test, and they'll say, okay, it still looks as a sella. But what about weight? What about how much weighs? If it, some people have sensitive hands. Some people more than others. You put a coin in your hand, and someone can tell you, oh, this weighs 4 ounces. How do you know? Well, I just feel it. I have enough experience that I can feel it. Another person will say, no, to me, I don't really, I can't tell from putting it in my hand. So says the Gemara, the akati lo pachsa b'chdei oinosa, that when it says Yesera, it doesn't mean it eroded physically to the point where the coin has changed its dimension. What we're talking about is weight. We're talking about how much it weighs. So this way, the Gemara is going to get out of the kasha. It's a raya against Rav Huna. Why? Because when it says Yesera, if it means that it hasn't physically eroded to the point of oino, but in weight it has declined. So then machra b'shava, that he has to sell for its actual worth, because the weight has decreased, not necessarily the physical size of the coin. Why is that better? Because according to Rav Huna wasn't talking about weight. He was talking about the physicality, the look of the coin. Is if a coin erodes up to the point where it is debatable whether it's a shekel or a sella, you should throw it out. Of course, throw out a coin that has declined below a shekel. But even if it's around a shekel, where people will say, okay, this is a sella, I can use it as a sella, that would be theft. I mean, basically he's saying that would be, oh no, you'll be cheating. So now the Gemara is telling us, okay, that's not a raya that Rav Huna is wrong, because we're talking about weight, not the physicality, the physical look of the coin. If we're talking about weight, then you can still hold like Rav Huna, that if a coin has physically declined to where it's around a shekel or slightly less or slightly more, that you may have to throw out because physically it doesn't meet the test. But if it's only weight, then okay, so Rav Huna's view is still intact because we're talking about weight. So this is what I mean with the Gemara. We're up against the kasha. We have no answer. So again, the Gemara says, okay, so in order to reconcile Rav Huna and Rav Ami, we have to say, we're not talking about physicality, about the physical coin. We're talking about the weight of the coin. This is how the Gemara answers. Yeah, Jay.
So we're talking about where they're switching back and forth between two measures. One is visual, what the eye can see, and the other is weight. Now, the weight can be done very accurately. The physical, the eye, the oral vision doesn't have the same accuracy as weight. So why do they allow the oral, it looks like, to be equivalent to weight when in fact they're nowhere near the same accuracy that a human being can handle?
But your question is really the answer. Because weight can be judged more accurately because they have scales and whatever else.
Yeah, right,
Therefore, says the Gemara, we really should only be talking about weight because weight is easier to determine, and therefore we can say, is it a shekel? Is it a selah? Is it a dinar? Well, let's look at the weight. Let's put it on the scale. Let's figure it out. But when you're talking about the eye test, that could be more subjective. You might look at a coin and say, you know what? This really looks pretty bad. It looks like it's nowhere that no way you should be using this as a seller because it's eroded. And my eye test might be, what do you mean? This isn't so bad. I mean, I can see this, when you have a lot of coins in your pocket and you're jingling the coins, they can say, okay, this is a seller. This may be a little bit less, but it's still a seller. So in other words, the very fact that weight might be a better determinant, that's logical for the Gemara to answer. You know what? It's no kasha on Rav Huna because weight is the test, not physicality, not how it looks or how it thinks. So if Rav Huna is going to interpret it as the litmus test as physicality, then he could be right. He could be right that when it actually erodes to a certain point, but we're not discussing that. We're discussing weight. And if that price is discussing weight, then Rav Huna is still intact. There's no kasha on Rav Huna.
But why do they allow the visual to be valid enough to argue over things? Because there's going to be machlokas over a coin. What is it? Is it one way or is it the other way? It looks this way, but it weighs something else. So they could have cleaned it all up by saying weight.
You should only look at weight as a measure. You're right, and the Gemara didn't do that. They didn't say that weight is the only way of determining a coin. It's not.
They didn't do that.
Yeah, you're right. They didn't do that. So that gives rise to this problem of, well, if weight is one thing and the physical appearance is something else, what do we do? So the Gemara wants to tell us that at least with respect to the discussion of physicality, that's a whole nother discussion to Rav Huna and Rav Ami. But when it comes to the brisa that was talking about, so what do we actually do with the coin and everything else? There we're looking. The Gemara is now telling us we're not looking at physicality. We're looking at weight. But they didn't say that. Forget about physicality. Weight is the only measure. It's obviously.
Rabbi,
Michael.
I want to expand on Jay's point. Avram Avinu had to weigh silver for purchasing
for Ephron and the Morris Machpelah, right?
That was weight. And I would assume, but you correct me if I'm wrong, that the reason they went to coinage so that they would get away from weight, even though initially it probably was corresponding to weight. But if something is denoted as a coin, the idea is so that you wouldn't have to weigh everything out, that it would be demarcated as coinage.
As coinage.
So you get to the point where it's no longer, they don't any longer mean the same. So the coin is emblematic of the value. It's kind of like what we have in terms of,
so we don't worry about the weight of the
silver dollars, and we don't have silver dollars anymore.
Right.
So, we introduce other metals into them. So the point is that at that point you're mixing metaphors. So if you're in weight, then you're going to weigh out metal, and then the coin doesn't matter because the coin no longer is equivalent. So if it's rubbed off on the coin that it's not one sela, then there's a legitimate question. And so if you go to correspond to weight, that just seems like a cop-out because it's not any longer corresponding to weight. So to the earlier points that were made by both Menashe and Jay, you take it out of circulation because you don't know what it was because it's faded to that point. On the other hand, if it still says a sell on it, but it's eroded on the other side of the coin and the weight is actually gone down, how can you detract from its value because it's still indicated that way? So I look at coinage in its evolution as a substitute for the actual weight and value. And so who knows where they were at that point in time when the Gemara was written, how if it was equivalent or not equivalent. So I don't understand how you can go back and forth to Jay's earlier
But,
point.
that's a very good point, but you see, this whole discussion that we've had for these weeks we only focused on coinage, on physicality. This teretz, like you said, to use the word cop-out, this teretz that the Gemara is giving us is in effect a reinterpretation in order to not exclude Rav Huna from the discussion. You're right. We're talking about physicality, whatever it was, the Avraham Avinu, whatever it was at those times. But in the time of we're talking about a coin, the way a coin looks, the way a coin. That was the measure. The Gemara is only trying to justify. And that's why I say sometimes the Gemara is in a corner, it's backed into a corner, and how do you give a teretz? They only did this because they wanted to justify and say that Rav Huna is not necessarily wrong. If you want to admit that Rav Huna is wrong, that his position of yikuts, of getting rid of a coin, is whether it's higher or lower, then we would find him to be wrong, because this brisa doesn't say you throw it out just because it's eroded up to that point. So the Gemara has to do a quick shift and say, you know what, that brisa doesn't talk about physicality, the actual coinage. It talks about weight.
I
But
don't
he's
agree
kind
with
of a
that.
sleight of hand.
Physicality is both weight and looks. It's both physicality. But I can say that maybe where Rav Huna was, they didn't worry about what the value that was imprinted on it. They were worried about the weight. So maybe
That's correct.
the interpretation is only based on weight because it was equivalent, and where everyone else wasn't that way. So it's not that you can argue it's not a cop-out, but he didn't factor in the values because maybe the value the coin on there was equivalent to the actual weight during his time period. But still, it's all physical, and if you adopt that the coin is indicative at that point in time, the coin is indicative of the value regardless of what the weight is, it's either one or the other. It can't be both. So I can understand a different interpretation, and I can understand them going back to Rav Huna. But during the time that that they're adjudicating this or they're debating this, it's what matters at that time. Is it weight or is it the appearance?
But Michael, it may not have been settled which one it was. So
Right.
depending, like you said, depending maybe on where you were or what you might say in one region or in one place, maybe weight was the more accurate measure, and in one place physicality. Clearly, they were both in play. They were both in play.
Rabbi, I'd like to put a little fuel on this fire here. But first answer me a question. Which is the bigger coin, the larger coin?
Sela is the larger coin, shekel is a smaller coin, and dinar is even smaller.
Okay, it's like interesting if you take the I think the sela.
The sela is like the dollar,
and if it's eroded away to where the diameter is 50% of the original diameter, the value, the volume, assuming that the thickness is the same, is a quarter of it. So that would be the dinar. So if a sela was decreased in diameter by 50%, the area would be the volume would be a quarter of the volume, or that would correspond to a dinar.
And you're saying this because how do you know that?
Because
that's just simple geometry.
I'm assuming that
he's doing the math.
That the thickness is the same, and a disk goes as a square root of the area, the square of the diameter. So if you take the square root of if you square 50%, if it goes down by a half, then
because pi r squared.
So
hold on one second. When you say
could go down not to a shekel, but to go
to a dinar. But remember, one of the problems is, let's just say that the dinar was the size of a silver dollar, and it started eroding. It became thinner and thinner. It still had the diameter of a dollar, but it had the thickness of half of its original. So
then it would be like a shekel.
What's
If the
that?
diameter stayed the same, it was just the thickness.
There's just
It's
the
down by
thickness,
50%, then
right,
it would
just
correspond to a shekel.
So,
Right.
yeah, I looked up a little bit, and it's very interesting. So I put in the chat that modern coins, U.S., UK, it's typically 30 to 40 years if they're kept in constant circulation, as opposed to sitting in a jar, or a piggy bank. But whereas paper money, of course, is much faster. But even paper money, it's typically several years. And in a way, that's presumably the ancient coins, because they didn't have paper money, were used a lot more. But at the same time, I looked up and found some stuff looking, say, okay, Roman coins, which is close to contemporary, certainly contemporary with the Gemara, even if not to Beis Hamikdash. And it was similar sorts of times, 30, 40 years, but sometimes much more than that. And in fact, fascinating, there are coins from Roman times that were of a particular size and presumably weight that 1,000 years or more later were re-stamped to become Spanish coins or other coins that were basically the same size, even though they were clearly worn down somewhat at the time and so on. So I think the face value of coins, at least, don't know in terms of we're trying to figure out here in Eretz Yisrael, but in general, the face values, the nominal weight, seemed to matter a lot for a long time. That even when coins were quite a bit worn down, it really meant something, even though it was, a true silver standard that you're looking at. How much silver is it really? Coins mattered a lot.
Yeah.
Rabbi,
Face value.
this is Yale. If I could just jump in, I wonder if the answer is not really a combination of the two, because again, people back then, they were not collecting coins; they were using coins in commerce.
Right.
So if a coin was identifiable, if a seller was identifiable as a seller, even if you're concerned that it may be a little light on weight, but clearly it's stamped as a seller, and you were confident that the next person, you're a shopkeeper, you're being asked to accept it, and you know that you can turn around and you can send it to the farmer because a seller is a seller, then you would accept it even if it seemed a little light. It's more when it no longer appears to be a seller that you really get into the weight. It was back in the days when I'm a coin collector. So back in the days when we were on the gold, we had gold coins and silver coins. Coins would be worn down. A gold coin, a $5 gold piece would be worn down, but it was still typically accepted as a $5 gold piece because it had $5 stamped on it, and you understood that the next person along would likely accept it for $5, even if the weight, because again, coins, you can't help it, especially gold and silver back then. They're very soft metals, and they do tend to wear down.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a lot of impurities in them. But as long as you could identify it as a $5 gold piece, it was still typically accepted as a $5 gold piece until you couldn't recognize it anymore.
Right. And you're going to see from the Gemara, Yael, to your point, you're going to see as we go further into the Gemara that there were people who were more makbid and less makbid. It wasn't like one size fits all. Apparently, at that time, and the Gemara even says it, there are, especially with money changers, but even outside of money changers, there were people like you who said, wait a minute, I understand coins, I know coins, and this coin is no, I wouldn't know the difference. You know the difference. So to you, I'm more makbid that this coin isn't $5 piece or $1 piece, whatever.
Right.
So you're dealing with a lot of subjectivity, and the Gemara is trying to sort of balance out, let's have one discussion and one size fit all. So the Gemara was hoping to say that the one size fits all is physicality. And here the Gemara says, you know what, that Brisa wasn't talking about physicality, it was talking about weight. So in other words, this introduces that question of weight, which, by the way, until now, we haven't really talked about weight. All of a sudden, the Gemara says, and this is all in defense of Rav Huna. We could have said, you know what, Rav Huna's wrong. The Gemara doesn't want to say Rav Huna is wrong. So the Gemara wants to try to defend Rav Huna by saying that, you know what, it's a weight issue. Rav Huna is right, but that Brisa was talking about a weight issue. And to everybody's point, I don't know that there was uniformity everywhere, that in every region it was, oh, it's the weight that matters, or it's the size of the coin that matters. There could have been a mix of that, and clearly the Gemara is saying that when the Brisa said it, That's what it meant. Okay, so that brisa happened to mean weight. But if we're talking about another Gemara or another Mishnah or another brisa, maybe it's the point is that it was not a uniform across the board, everybody agrees system. Coinage seemed to be a little bit more subjective than maybe we would like it to be. So that's why the Gemara can answer what it answers. You know what? You're not right. We're not talking about physicality. We're talking about weight. Anyway, let's just go a little bit further because this Gemara wants to try to really get to the bottom of the machlokes of Rav Huna and Rav Ashi. So they asked a question and said, no, it's no raya. Meisavei, let's go a little further. So they said, I'll ask you another kasha to show you that Rav Huna is not right, that we're not talking about Rav Huna's view. Why? Akama, the Gemara, there's that brisa says, Akama tipoches, v'rishai l'kaima. Okay, how much can it be reduced in size and you still can keep it? Forgetting about using it, just in other words, keeping it so that you can have it sort of in your coinage inventory. So the brisa says, "Besela ad shekel," that with a sela, if it's worn down to a shekel, but more than that, you shouldn't even keep it. Says the Gemara, "My love, the pachas purta purta." Would you not think, which is logical, that how does a sela get to a shekel? It erodes a little bit, a little bit, a little bit over time. In other words, the erosion happens over the course of years. Clearly, from what we understand, Menashe points out that it sometimes can be 30 years, 40 years, or some length of time. So it's purta purta. Now, what does it mean that it erodes a little bit of the time? That even though it erodes and gets to the point where it's almost a shekel, but not quite, and still we say you can use it, that's a kasha on Rav Huna. Because according to Rav Huna, even if it's more than a shekel, right? He says more or less. According to Rav Huna, even if it's more than a shekel, you should throw it out because it's not really a selah and people will think it's a selah. But wait a minute. If it erodes a little bit at a time, and that brisa says, you know what? You can keep it until it becomes a little bit a shekel. But what happens if it's a shekel plus a little bit? Oh, that's fine. That's okay. But according to Rav Huna, that's not okay. According to Rav Huna, if it's a little bit more than a shekel, you have to get rid of it because of the confusion. And so he wants to bring another raya from the words of the brisa that we don't hold like Rav Huna. Because if it erodes a little bit at a time, there's a point in time where it is so close to a shekel, but not yet below, where according to the brisa, it's okay, and according to Rav Huna, it's not okay. So l'chayra is a kasha on Rav Huna. To Rav Ami, it's no problem because it never went below the level. But according to Rav Huna, it can even be above the level and still not be good. You have to remove it. Yakitz, it means you have to cut it up or destroy it. But why should you destroy it? The brisa says that it's good. So that's another kasha that the Gemara wants to pose as to why the halach is not like Rav Huna. Remember, we've seen this again and again. I just want to reemphasize. These Amoraim, they were sitting together and they were going through the Mishnah and the Brisa, and they want to get to the bottom of it. There's a Chalkis, Rav Huna, Rav Ami, who's right? Okay, they both can't be right, so who's right? So the Gemara asks a kasha, I'll bring you raya, it's not like Rav Huna. No raya because we're talking about weight. Now the Gemara asks another kasha, bring a raya, it's not like Rav Huna because the Brisa says clearly a coin that erodes a little bit at a time until it gets to that magic area where it's slightly above a shekel and it's okay. Rav Huna says it's not okay. So that's the kasha of Rav Huna. Emphit the Gemara low. Once again, I'm going to tell you very clearly, this is the Amoraim sitting together and trying to find a way to justify Rav Huna that Rav Huna is not wrong. They could have left it at that and said that halacha is not like Rav Huna. Says the Gemara lo, the nafal lemura, the ifchus bechada zimna. No, we're talking about a case. I know, Michael, you're going to jump on this. We're talking about a case where the coin fell into a hot fire, and the fire melted it or whatever it did to reduce it to the size of a shekel. So it didn't happen porta. It didn't happen a little bit of a time. It happened almost at one time. That's the case of the Gemara, where the Gemara is talking about this machlokes of Rav Huna and Rav Ami, and the Gemara wants to say it's no raya against Rav Huna because it never reached the point of slightly above a shekel, because it literally melted down to a shekel. And if it melts down to a shekel, or maybe slightly less, then even Rav Ami admits that that's a coin you have to get rid of. So it's no riot to Rav Huna if it's slightly more than a shekel, you have to get rid of it, because our brisa isn't talking about that. It's talking about a coin that literally went overnight from a sela or close to a sela to a shekel and never reached the point of a shekel plus. And so the
What
question
happened to the
remains, what do you do with a shekel plus? And that's the machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Ami, and there's no riot to it because that's not what the Bryce is telling us. So again,
When
it's
you
a little
melt
bit
it-
of a as to how we get there, but the Gemara does not want to. In other words, in respect to Rav Huna, I'm thinking they're saying it's no raya. Rav Huna is wrong because our Brysa can't bring a raya that Rav Huna is wrong from a case that does not line up with Rav Huna's situation.
But when you melted it down, it has the same weight unless you're taking some of it out. So if you by the
Does it
weight,
really? I don't know. I mean, is that the
how
case?
do you melt something
If you melt
much
something
larger
down,
and it weighs more when you start before you melt it.
It's going to weigh the same amount before or after. So
Yeah, it should
only two things can happen. One is that it
be a
melts,
very heavy
and by the
shekel.
one is that it melts, and when you pull it out, some of it came off because it was still melting, and so on, and you lose some. The other possibility, though, is maybe is that before it had already lost a lot of value, but you didn't know it until, or you didn't know quite how much because you didn't bother to weigh it because it still looked like a shekel or whatever. And now that it melted, well, now it's not recognizable as what exactly for sure it was. So you go ahead and weigh it, and now you know what you got. And it's a lot less.
right? But this version of the Gemara does not require a discussion on weight. We're still talking about the physicality,
Which
and
is
we're
why,
saying,
how could you say that the physical appearance went down to a shekel if it's not weight? Because let's say that it burned, which it did, burn the writing off of it, so the designation is not there. So how can you say, well, it's equivalent to a shekel?
The only way you can tell is the weight.
Size, it's still, I mean, it's still, all the metal is there. It doesn't compute.
no, but wait a minute. If you put it into the fire and it starts melting, won't the physical coin be smaller?
No.
It could be anything when you pull it out, depending on how it landed or whatever.
I
Could be
no,
stretched out. It
It's
could be
metal.
more compact, but it's the same metal.
No, but I think the
Same
Gemara's
metal.
answer here presupposes that the coin itself became smaller, so that l'chayra, you could say, if it's smaller, then you would see it's not a sela, and that should be a raya against
Well,
Rav
maybe it's
Huna.
smaller, but it's fatter.
Exactly. It's going to be the same metal. It's
It
got
has
to
to
be the
weigh the
same
same.
metal. If it was 8 grams going in, it's going to be 8 grams going out. It might be more closer to a sphere now, but then it's going to be narrower, but it's going to be thicker. Or it might have fallen and cooled as it flattened out, and then it would be like a pita bread, and then it would be thinner but wider. And the only way you can tell at that point is to weigh it.
Be the thickest shekel in circulation.
So when the Gemara, okay, so listen to the language of the Gemara.
Unless it was very close to the shekel equivalent before it went into the melting process. And so therefore you didn't lose anything, but it came out as being a little bit larger shekel, but it didn't go from, because you can't lose metal when you're burning it.
Right. You're not burning. No, the key is that you're not burning it. You're melting it. To actually burn it, you would lose, but that would require thousands and thousands of degrees. It didn't burn, it melted.
So let's look at the language of the Gemara and let's understand. The Gemara says the nafal anura v'ifkum chadazimna, that if a coin fell into a fire and it reduced it from a sela to a shekel. So what does that mean? What was reduced? What was reduced from a sela to a shekel? The proportion of the coin, right? Not the weight, like you said, doesn't change. The coin itself looked smaller. Now you're gonna say, maybe it was thicker on the bottom, it looked like a different coin, but it didn't have the diameter of a sella. So when you look at a sella coin, say, oh, this is a sella because it's
it
3
wasn't
inches
being-
round. Now all of a sudden it's 2 inches or 1.5 inches round. It clearly doesn't look like a sella
Then it
anymore.
wasn't being melted, it was being burned. I mean, melting is very different than just burning it at high temperature. It's not melting.
In essence, it's not a coin anymore if it's changed shape, because it's not in the shape of a coin.
Yeah, so we have to understand what the Gemara means when
Right,
it
and I
says.
think it would have. Well, the logical thing is that it melted or burned, whatever, and now it's unrecognizable. So it's unrecognizable, and you now go to weigh it, and you figure out, okay, based on weight, this must be whatever.
But that's only if it's burned. If it's melted, it's the same weight. So
No, either way,
Yeah,
but you don't know.
Nasha, unless you said
It was
already
a
deteriorated.
22-gram coin, and
Right.
now, but it had gradually worn out over time. But you didn't know because you looked.
Right.
The face
Right.
was a little rubbed out. The edges
was
were a
still
little
marked.
chipped.
It
Right.
had markings before it went
Right.
into a
Right.
fire.
It had markings that said this is a Sella. And
Right.
now
Logical
that it
explanation.
melted, you have to
Markings
figure
get-
out what is it
The markings get all messed up.
when
So
you
when the
melt it.
Gemara
Yeah.
says that it reduced itself in size from a sella to a shekel, how do we understand that?
That's what
redu-
I
Think about a
can't figure out.
candle. A candle burns away and it's clearly less.
It's got to be clearly less because the Gemara is telling us that when you looked at it, it didn't look like a sella, it looked like a shekel. Tell me how it could look like a shekel,
It
not a sella.
started off being very close to the weight of a shekel.
No, we're not talking weight, Jay. We're not talking weight. We're talking
but
physical size. A sella looks like this. A shekel looks like this. You put it into the fire. It went from this to this. That's what the Gemara is saying. So how does that happen? How does it go into the fire and become from the diameter of a sella to the diameter of a shekel? Because this is an appearance.
Because they're ignoring how thick it is. They didn't mention how thick it is.
They may be ignoring how thick it is, but when you look at it, you can clearly say this can't be a sella.
The diameter is too
No,
small
it's
to be a
smaller.
sella.
What's that?
The diameter is too small to be a sella, so they are assuming it's a shekel.
That's correct.
So it's a very thick shekel.
But
A very thick shekel. Okay, we got it. A very thick shekel.
but in practice, it's no longer a coin.
Yeah, exactly.
Treated it as a
And
coin,
once it's
Michael.
once it's no longer a coin, you know that it was a coin. Now it's no longer recognizable, certainly as any particular coin. So
Markings-
therefore, you go to the scales to weigh it and say, how much silver is it?
Gotta be
It's
now.
11 grams, it's a shekel. It's 22 grams, it's a sella, etc.
I don't know. We're missing something here in this story.
Well, again, when you look at the language of the Gemara is, and we have to be careful, the nafal l'tzura, it fell into a fire, the ifchos, and it was reduced, it became pachos. It was reduced, b'chado zimna, at one time, it means in one event, it was reduced, not porta, not over the course of time, but in one event, this coin fell into the fire, and by the time they pulled it out, it did not have the diameter, the physical appearance of a sella. It had the appearance of a shekel. Now, we're going to argue here or discuss, well, it may have been smaller in diameter, but thicker and the same weight. Forget about weight. We're not, this discussion does not include weight. Weight was the first discussion, and so that was a teretz. Then they asked another kasha. We're not going back to weight. We're saying it looked like if it reduced a little at a time, it's not like Rav Huna. Teretz is it's
We
still
don't
like
know.
Rav Huna because we don't know what would happen if it was slightly more than a shekel. Would we accept it or not, like Rav Huna or Rav Ami? Because our case doesn't talk about that. It talks about strictly where it has the appearance of a shekel. And when it has an appearance of a shekel, that's different. So then Rav Huna's discussion and Rav Ami Rav Huna's discussion isn't relevant to this brisa,
So
and that's the answer how we get away from Rav Huna. But
But
Unless
the
it was a
Gemara is
flood
saying,
miracle.
the Gemara is
we want
saying
to
that
extrapolate.
something, a physical event, the coin was put into the fire, and
Yeah.
out came something that looked like a shekel.
Right.
So the question is, how could that happen? I mean, they did it. I mean, it was a
Right.
physical event that
Right.
happened. So
Right.
we're trying to figure out, did it
How it
become
was
thicker?
reduced from a seller to a shekel, notwithstanding everybody's
So
claim.
you have
that-
to assume either it was the full diameter when you started, but it was thinner, it rubbed away some of the thinness, or the diameter was much smaller than this.
It
than a
sounds like the
seller to begin
diameter
with.
was smaller because a shekel inherently is a smaller coin than a
Right.
seller.
So if you say that we're just melting, we have to end up with the same amount of material that it started it with when it went into this thing called fire. I don't know which chemical and which scientific answer will explain what had to go into the fire and what came out of the fire.
Right.
Maybe it
If it
wasn't
was
all
all
that
weight.
metal. Maybe it was plugged with a different metal that was combustible.
Nah. No.
Yeah, I mean, again,
Why don't we let Menashe figure it out
Well,
since he
but we have to
I haven't quite figured. I gave
have to
my
have some
theory, but I
bikias.
haven't
You
quite
have to have
figured it
someone
out.
with a little bikias and understanding what actually happens when a coin sits in a fire long enough
exactly.
that
I think one question, and so I'm looking that the melting temperature, it varies apparently by alloy, but it's somewhere on the order of 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty hot, but which can happen with the fire. And obviously they had such fires because they minted
you
the
throw it in
coins
a
and so on.
furnace. It fell into
Right.
a furnace.
Right.
They did
So-
pottery in those days.
Yeah, all kinds of things. So it's not the kind of, it wouldn't be your regular oven, but it wasn't so unusual. But then the question is, when the Gemara says it fell in the fire and eroded, does that mean, like I'm positing that, but which may or may not be what it's talking about, that it melted down to be unrecognizable, and then therefore you had to weigh it, and so it effectively eroded all at once because now you have to acknowledge what the true weight is? Or is it maybe that it fell down and melted, and when you pulled it out, you only got 3/4 of it because some of it stuck to the furnace or melted and dripped away or something like that?
But that can happen, right? So actually, you can have a coin that actually loses some of its volume because of
Well,
the fire.
when it melts, the first thing that you're going to lose is the fine features, the face,
Right.
the numbers, etc.
Right.
But
Mhm.
eventually, if it melts, if it stays there long enough in the furnace, it's going to start to run away. Just like, think about cast iron furnace or whatever, it melts and runs away.
And that's what I'm thinking
Liquid.
here is what the Gemara is telling us, that it is running off so that by the time you
So if you
pull
retrieve
out,
it, maybe you only get part of it. Maybe.
yeah, you only
maybe.
get part of it, because weight is not the issue here. I want to repeat, this is not, oh, we have to weigh it to see, oh, it's the same weight.
But you
it's
have to weigh it at this point, because once it's melted and you've lost the face value, you've probably let's put it this way: if it's melted to the point that parts of silver conducts incredibly well, so if it melts to the point that part of it separates out, then for sure it's lost all the other attributes of a nice, round, flat coin.
Right. And so that's what the Gemara doesn't even suggest that we have a discussion on weight, Menashe. So I don't think we can introduce weight into the discussion and say, okay, now let's weigh it. The Gemara is simply telling us that if you put it into the fire, obviously you keep it in the fire long enough so that it reduces its physical appearance somehow from a selah to a shekel. Its physical appearance, when you look at it and you pull it out and say, this is a shekel, can't be a selah. It doesn't have the circumference, the diameter, whatever, of a selah. That's what this teretz is. Now, it must have happened because I don't think they just pull it out of air. And maybe again, if you keep it long enough, it'll run off or whatever, and the physical coin will be a smaller coin than when you put it into the fire. That's, I think, what we have to accept as the answer. How we get there, that's what our discussion is, how we get there. But the bottom line is that it now has become a shekel, and therefore exonerates Rav Huna's position, or doesn't suggest that Rav Huna's position is wrong, because we're now at a shekel, not a shekel plus. That's the bottom line here, that we understand. That's what the Gemara is trying to prove, is that we can never, it doesn't introduce Rav Huna's situation to give us a practical answer of whether the halakha is like Rav Ami or Rav Huna. This discussion we're having, which is fascinating, is the coin itself. How does it happen? I don't happen to, I don't understand, but it would seem that from the Gemara, they did understand that a coin can be reduced in physical size from a seller to a shekel by keeping it in a hot fire long enough so that it reduced its physical size, not weight, its physical size to the size of a shekel. So that ultimately is how we have to leave it. So what have we seen? We've seen the machlokes Rav Huna Rav Ami, two attempts to try to show that Rav Huna was not correct from this brisa, from different language in the brisa, and in both cases we slugged it up and say you can't bring a raya from this brisa against Rav Huna because of the facts that the Gemara is telling us. And here it's telling us that there was a fire that consumed it and didn't let it get to, the point where Rav Huna would say yes and we say no, or vice versa. Rav Huna says no and we say yes. All right, so we'll stop here, because again, now the Gemara keeps continuing to give us the different scenarios of the Mishnah, and piece by piece, and some of the things that I suggested at the beginning, we're still going to get to when we understand. Again, we're going to talk about money changers and money changers' attitude. It seems like the money changers had a lot of influence on what was going on with coinage. Maybe they weren't banks, or there were many less banks, and money changers were and they decided, what the value was. They're the ones who told you, no, this is what you're getting in trade. It's almost like the money changers today. When you go to Israel and you want to know how many you get for your dollar, one guy may give you 3.5 shekalim, and one guy may give you 3.48, and one guy gives you 3.57. But they're the ones who are controlling based on the market rate, of course. So anyway, that's again, we're talking about 1,000 years ago was a whole different approach to coinage and money, but it's fascinating to see how this discussion goes. Yeah, Jay.
We need to find a metallurgist this week and have him explain what happens
with coinage,
with coins, ancient coins that go into a fire.
Yeah, maybe we can. Maybe
there are a couple of things that happen. Number one, they could melt, and number two, they could oxidize into some other substance. The oxidation could flake off or something.
Yeah, so maybe we have.
Sounds like you're volunteering, Jonathan. It sounds like you're volunteering to
we have to have some scientists who have some experience in this who can give us some insight into the melting of coinage. And again, it's fascinating because you wouldn't think this is something that is a subject of the Gemara, but clearly it is a subject of the Gemara, where they looked at melted coins and sort of made a determination. Anyway, fascinating discussion. Of course, we have to leave it with a little bit of a question mark, but hopefully we'll get some answers. I'll look a little bit, of others to look too, and come back maybe with a little bit more insight into. I didn't think about it when I was
be able to explain what the Gemara meant.
Yeah, that it's this complicated. Anyway, all right.
So,